one of the foundations of why sociology as a discipline has actually been established and actually expanded. And that is the issue of, or the concerns about crime. And we're fortunate enough that we will have a speaker about crime, and after that, a launching on the book on crime. But let me first introduce the speaker, who's a very good friend of many of us at the department, and also beyond the department. He's been a friend for decades already, and also a friend for than others. But I owe our speaker big time on apology, because I stood him up on an academic date. Today is Valentine's Day, right? That was big time. Way back in 2014, I was supposed to travel to Singapore to give a lecture in his class, and I think I put him on the line. But me being myself, who's not just too careless, but bordering on probably a fool and stupid in between. I didn't check my passport. I was so confident that I have all my passport worked out, because I've just been traveling around. And as it turned out, when I was at the airport, my passport was 4 days expired. That was very, very bad. I haven't really made up to George. This is not a way of making it up yet. I've mentioned the name already. Our speaker is Dr. George Radics. He's a senior lecturer at the National University of Singapore, Department of Sociology, where Dr. Ubisti has finished, and Dr. Cornelio has also finished. So they're all part of the gang, the NUS mafia, I presuppose. So George will be with us to talk about crime and delinquency, which is also tied up to his book, Criminal Legalities and Minorities in the Global South. Rights and Resistance in the Decolonial World, which he will be launching. We will only represent and participating in after the talk. And I understand that most of the students who attended now is giving a course on crime and delinquency. So this really ties up to the lecture and the book. I hope they'll buy afterwards. But I think we also have other guests and other participants who's coming, even though they're not in the course. So without further ado, I'll also introduce one of our faculty who's teaching crime and delinquency, Dr. Lisa Lim. So he'll also be listening. So thank you very much for coming, and without further ado, I give the floor to George, and also the MC floor to Nino later. Thank you, George. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kanura. It's been 20 years since I know this guy, and I don't know what to talk about. You don't know anything. We actually did deliver the lecture over Skype.
Yeah, Skype.
It was a great lecture. Yeah, it was great.
The days before Zoom.
Before Zoom, right? And I want to thank Dayo, and of course, Professor Nino, Luiste, for allowing me to deliver this talk today. And thank you all for attending. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about crime and deviance. Now, I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology, where I teach the deviance modules at second year level, third year level. I also teach law and justice. So I'll be talking a little bit about things you might already be familiar with. So how many of you are sociology students? So how many of you have already taken an introduction to sociology of deviance models? Oh, okay, good. So hopefully some of this information will be new. I'm going to be giving a little bit of a background to the sociology of deviance, so that you can understand kind of where I'm coming from as I put together this edited book. So I'm going to start off talking about crime, and then I'll talk about the chapters, and I'll open up for questions. Now, I have to say, you can scan the code and you can look at the book. I don't expect you to buy it because it's actually kind of expensive. But you can ask your librarian to purchase it, and then you can download a copy of the book for free. Or you can email me and I can send it.
It has been purchased just recently. The other one. The library has purchased it.
Oh, the library's purchased.
So you're free to email us.
So you can download the books, and if you're interested, the fantastic thing about this book was that I was able to work with people from across the world, from Argentina, Brazil, to Malawi, and Africa. If any chapter is of interest to you, just let me know, and I'll put you in contact with the author so you can ask all the questions. So let me just jump into this short presentation. We're only going to be about 20 minutes, and then we can talk about the chapters and we can talk about the book. All right, just make sure. I'll just stand here. So let me just briefly tell you a little bit about the book, and then we'll talk about time. So I'm based at the National University of Singapore, where I met Professor Ateneo and also Professor Decolonial. And I think one of the great things about doing your graduate work outside of the global north is that your positionality shifts. You know, I did my undergraduate degree in the United States. I'm actually from California. And when you study social theory, when you study philosophy, it always centers on these ideas of universalism, egalitarianism, fairness, and justice. But when I came to Singapore to do my PhD, I realized that it's very difficult to apply these notions of egalitarianism and fairness because these were stemming from a different history. Right? And so much of my work is kind of exploring how these things emerged in the global south, in a different context. And I'll explore what that means. So for instance, when we look at minorities, and I'll talk a little bit about the concept of minorities as well. Minorities stems from ethnic studies in the United States, or this idea that communities deserve respect, and there's this universal doctrine of rights. But when we get to the global south, we realize that we have these really entrenched views of certain communities, certain linguistic groups, certain genders that should be erased or eradicated in order to create a modern state. But we have concepts and ideas coming from the colonial metropole that are transported to our societies. It transforms the way in which we see the world. So we're trying to break away from these global northern ideas about justice and fairness. Not to say that they are inapplicable, but to see how they manifest and how alternatives can emerge from the global south. We also talk about, when we talk about minorities, certain concepts we're used to. For instance, the idea of feminism, the idea of identity politics, which specifically with regards to race. In the United States, there are these concepts, for instance, like settler colonialism. I don't know if you've heard of this concept. Or indigeneity is a very popular concept, to the point where a lot of the work on race is being framed within these concepts of race. Settler colonialism is the idea that you have these white people from the UK coming to the US, and then they eradicated indigenous communities. Or Australia is a perfect example. You have white people coming over and getting rid of all of the different indigenous populations. And so this frames their knowledge of how race works. And then those concepts become exported to places in the global south. So how would we conceptualize settlers in the Philippines? Would the Tagalog suddenly become the settlers? Or in Singapore, would the Chinese become settlers? So these frameworks don't exactly work. Right? So when we talk about race, we're going to introduce different concepts of race, different concepts of marginalization. But last but not least, I don't want to make it seem as when we talk about minorities, this is an issue of exploitation, but rather this is an issue or oppression, but rather an issue of survival and how different groups that have been marginalized in society can kind of inspire us to see how we can live an alternative lifestyle and not feel like these people are people that we should pity or that we should see as victims, but rather as survivors, and people who inspire us to see the world. So let's talk a little bit about crime. So maybe this is stuff that you are familiar with. I'm going to start off with classical criminology, going back to kind of the philosophical underpinnings of criminology, which my editor, my co-editor, Pablo Chiocchini, he is a criminologist. I am a sociologist who's also trained in law. Right? So criminology isn't really my thing. I'm more of a sociologist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rest of the discussion I'll probably keep about the sociological definition. But we'll start off with classical criminology with the 1800s. We're going to talk about functionalism to kind of transition back to sociology of needs. Then we're going to look at the trajectory of the sociology of needs and sociology of crime. From functionalism to 1930s and 1960s, structural strain, subcultural theories and modern anarchism. We're going to move into the 1970s and 1990s. With the 1970s and 1990s with radical criminology, feminist criminology, and then we're going to end with a critique discussion on the book and all of the upcoming questions. So let's start off with classical criminology. So many of you are familiar with this picture here, right? Does anyone know what that is? It's a prison, yes. And what type of prison is it? It's the Panopticon, right? It's actually this fun. Jeremy Bentham, influenced by the Enlightenment ideals of how do we reform criminals? Shall we chop off their hands or brand them across their forehead for something that they've done poorly in the past? Well, we believe we can appeal to one's rationality. And we can watch, we can observe, we can get people to fear reprimand instead of physically, violently affecting them. We can just put them in a prison where they are watched. And so this was kind of the beginning of the Enlightenment ideals with regards to criminology. But, you know, criminology also has its problematic side, in my opinion. If you look at these pictures here, this is from Cesare Lombroso's positivist work on criminology. And he was an Italian criminologist who believed that if you study the shape of one's face, the closeness of one's eye, the length of a forehead, and if you do enough, you can identify what a criminal looks like. And he went so far as to say, women, we can do the same. In fact, he believed that women were super criminals. Because not only are they not socialized as well as men, so they are prone to lying, prone to cheating, but they can use their sexuality to manipulate them. So we can already see that there's some problems with the positivist view on crime and criminology. And finally, you have a picture here of the evolutionist view. When we take a biological approach of understanding humanity, it takes us to Charles Darwin's idea of evolution. And we tend to forget, because we always talk about Darwin as the evolution or origin of the species. Right? Everyone has heard that name, but the actual title is Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection or Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Favored races. So his work inherently put certain people on a pedestal and other people on the less favored races. And in fact, when we look at the influence of Darwinian thought on the social sciences, with the emergence of, for instance, like Herbert Spencer, the social organism theory that societies will eventually become more perfect, right? And they'll find some type of, they'll keep evolving until it becomes incredibly efficient. These theories became the basis for the rise of Nazis, when favored races are more efficient and less favored races should be eradicated. Right? And for these reasons, we as sociologists don't really acknowledge and kind of say, Herbert Spencer is not the foundation to sociology. Instead, we take on Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Right? Now, don't get me wrong, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim is to have a whole discipline based off of 3 dead white men is problematic. And furthermore, the way in which Marx, Weber, and have been framed have been problematic. But let's just look at why we look at why we view Marx, Weber, and Durkheim as important, particularly in the context of crime. So, this is Emil Durkheim with his famous work, The Rules of the Sociological Method. This is a pedagogical text that kind of introduced to the world how sociology should be done. And in it, he talks about crime from a different perspective from how the positivists and the criminologists of the past did. So he argues that there is no society that is not confronted with criminality. It's a double negative, but you get the point. There are no societies without criminals. All societies have criminals. All societies have deviants. We are all prone to criminality or deviance, but there are certain contextual factors that make us more prone or less prone. To classify crime among the phenomena of normal sociology is not to say that it is an inevitable, although regrettable phenomenon due to the incorrigible weakness of men, but is to affirm that it's a factor of the health and integral part of all societies. So the way in which Durkheim saw crime was that it was a barometer. It helped us see how healthy our society is. If there's too much crime, there's something going on in our society. If there is no crime at all, imagine living in a society where any minor infraction lead to repression. And so he says that we have never seen that in history. Something must be happening. Right? So if there's too much crime, there's a problem. If there's no crime, there's a problem. So he argues that the better a structure is articulated, the more it offers a healthy resistance to all modification. And this is equally true of functional as of anatomical organization. If there were no crimes, this condition could not be filled. For such a hypothesis presupposes that collective sentiments have arrived at a degree of intensity unrivaled in history. So Durkheim talks about crime as a healthy, natural aspect of our society, not as something that is due to the weaknesses of man, not as something that you can measure and try to eradicate and get rid of because of the natural evolution of our society, but rather that it is ever present. And so this gives us a different view on crime as well as our ability to drift into criminality. So let me take you through the evolution of deviance. Now that we have an idea of kind of this the sociological perspective. Okay, so I initially introduced Durkheim as a naturalist. And in fact, that was a Parsonian American interpretation of Durkheim. And if you take my social theory class, we go much more into this. But he is considered, he introduced the idea of time. The idea, if you take my social theory class, we talk about this kind of psychoanalytic, its philosophical underpinnings, we believe that deep in all of us are these insatiable desires. And society is meant to contain those desires. If society doesn't function well, those desires escape and get us to suffer from what we call animal. Right? So So this, we can say, is kind of the earlier stages of deviance. By the 1930s and 1940s, Alfred Parsons, Robert K. Merton, they took the ideas of dirt crime and made them more practical, more functional, so they could fit the American context that was suffering from the Great Depression. There were a lot of people who were not conforming, a lot of people who just refused to buy into the goals of our society. And so this is when we get the idea of structural strength. And that created a whole 2-3 decades of structural functionalist, structural strength theories of crime and deviance. And I'll give you a little bit of examples of these. By the 1950s and 1960s, we saw that the Great Depression was over. And suddenly, society was booming. There was a baby. There were GIs coming from World War II, coming back home, setting up families, setting up homes. And then the question is, well, why would people not want to buy into the American dream? And so there was all these theories that we call subcultural theory on deviance that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. But we all know about 1960s, 1970s, there was the Vietnam War. We saw that there was a anti-establishment kind of sensibility. And this gave birth to the symbolic interactionist movement, where many of you have taken social theory or sociology, you understand that symbolic interactions kind of break away from the functionalist view. Phenomenology, feminist theory on crime and deviance. By the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, at the end of the 1970s, we had 2 very influential texts that kind of introduced us to radical criminology, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then finally, we'll talk about how my book completes the cycle. But I'll talk about how I build upon some of these theories of deviance. Okay, that's the end. Okay, so when we talk about structural strain, I like to talk about it. I like to play the Rolling Stones. I can't get no satisfaction. Structural strain, Robert K. Merton believe that there are cultural goals and there are means of achieving those goals. But if there's something blocking that you can't achieve those goals, you'll innovate, right? You'll retract, you'll change the rules. Anything other than using those means to attain those goals is deviance. Okay? Now, by the 1950s and 1960s, we had subcultural theory with Robert K. Merton, Albert Cohen, who you see by the 1950s, we had a lot of theories on why are there young people who join gangs. Okay. So Delinquent Boys was an example of one of the primary studies in sort of this form of cultural theory with regards to deviance. It eventually evolved, and by the 1980s and 1990s, this cultural theory kept going, and we start to see, well, why is it that immigrant groups don't want to socialize? Why is it that there are, so it's somewhat problematic, because we're not looking structurally at why these groups and these individuals are acting up, but we kind of blame it on them for their problems. And so by the 1960s and 70s, we had symbolic interactions. This was a breakaway from these kind of functional, structural issues, and instead, we had George Mead, who looked at the individual, the I versus the me. We had Herbert Blumer, who believed that the individual is constantly constructed within a social context. We had Erving Goffman that took these ideas of the individual and said that there's a front stage and there's a backstage. All of this kind of helped build a foundation for Howard Becker's famous work on deviance, where he argues that you're not born a marijuana user. You have to learn to appreciate it. In fact, if you smoke marijuana, at first you're going to think, this is crazy, I feel strange, right? But you have to learn to appreciate it. You have to learn how to interact with other people who are marijuana. There's a whole process in which individuals quote unquote become a deviant. By the 1960s and 70s, we have the birth of feminism. Earlier we were looking at those photos, the biological photos of faces, foreheads, eyes that we could measure, and then we saw the Lombroso's photos of women, right? The deviant thing. By the 1960s and 70s, we start to realize that there are some very bad stereotypes and biases that are embedded in the way in which we view women that we need to uncover, that we need to explore. The fact that women don't go to prison as much as men is not because women are more conformist, but it's because they're more oppressed than men. They're more surveilled. The expectations are harsher on them than they are. When we start to understand and appreciate and interpret this and put it into our studies of deviance. By 1979, we had two very famous works on deviance. The first was, well, they're both emerging roughly at the same time. In the United States, we had On the Take by William Chambliss. Does anyone know, has anyone read anything by William Chambliss before? There's a famous sociological work that you always encounter in the first year introduction to sociology. Does anyone know what that is? There's a saint, and there's a, no? Saints and Roughnecks, yes, thank you. So, when in the introduction to sociology module, of course, you'll encounter William Chambliss. William Chambliss' Saints and Roughnecks and say that there are these teenagers who, some of them are wealthy, some of them can drive, they dress well, they're apologetic, but they go around doing deviant acts. And then there are other kids that are less well-dressed, who are a little bit more violent, and they do deviant acts, but one get off and one doesn't, right? The saints get off and the roughnecks don't. And we look at this as kind of like a labeling theory, somewhere around symbolic contractions. But the reality is, William Chambliss, for most of his career, you could say was a radical criminologist who basically argued that politics is deviance. His famous work, From Petty Crooks to Presidents, he was looking at kind of the corruption within local politics and showing how local politics radiates all the way up to the presidency. Corruption is endemic within politics. So our system, the capitalist system, creates criminals. Now this is a little bit more. This is a little bit more of a kind of a crass capitalist. This is the crass, unsophisticated Americans who look at capitalism as an exploitative bad system. But if you look at the European tradition, when you look at the European tradition, with, for instance, Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall, he was applying more of Antonio Gramsci hegemony, arguing that the media plus the state plus capitalism creates an all-encompassing exploitative environment in which individuals are being blamed. The capitalist system is exploiting us, but we blame immigrants, we blame the youth, right? And so there was a difference in one was more of a crass Marxist view, and one was a more sophisticated Gramscian view. But both were criticizing the capitalist system. Right? Now, this is the traditional modern view on crime and deviance from a Western perspective. But now I'm going to just briefly talk about my book and how we're a little bit different. So, for instance, if you look at the title of this book, it's called Criminal Legalities, Minorities, and the South. Rights and Resistance in Decolonial. Now, the term minorities initially was removed from the title. And I didn't know why. I'm one of the editors, co-editors of this book, and the term minorities suddenly disappeared from the title, and I asked my co-editor, what happened? And he said, in conversation with another colleague, they decided that the term minority was present. And I was thinking, okay, first of all, you're a white guy. Can I ask who your friend was? Another white guy. And I was thinking, I consider myself a minority on different levels, so how is it offensive? So don't explain to me. We'll go on to it. But then I had to do a lot of research. I spent a year kind of understanding why do people have problems with the term minorities. I was participating in this gender workshop at the University of Hawaii, and one of the presenters was Latino, and I remember I sat, patiently through his talk, and afterwards I emailed him and I said, what do you think about the word minority? And then he sent this very long email saying it's offensive and it's obnoxious, but we are not minorities. We, because he's Latino, so brown people are actually the majority in the world. And you can start to sense that the anger was coming from this distinctly American experience of being discriminated in the United States and being treated like a quote-unquote minority. And if you look at the research, if you look at the writings, minorities tend to be seen as black or brown in the United States. And so there is this animosity towards the term minority today. But if you just go a little bit further back, women, for instance, argue that we are not, or not, but women are not numerically the minority, but they ought to be considered minorities so they can get support, so that they can reach equality. And furthermore, if you look at the term minorities outside of the global north, suddenly this idea of being black or brown is no longer important, because that relationship that one has to majority versus minority completely shifts. So I argue that we have to put the term minority back into the title until we can find an alternative. If you look at the term rights in criminal law, I kind of alluded to this earlier on, the idea that in my contemporary social theory class, as an undergrad, psychology, we had to learn spheres of justice. We had to learn the male of ignorance. We had to learn all of these theories with regards to how do we live with people of diverse views and provide them with the same humanity and dignity. Very idealistic. And I think that these are not things that we should dismiss, but we have to accept that when you've had hundreds of years of colonization, when in your laws were entrenched values that are foreign to your own, when colonizers came in and created a divide and rule situation where certain groups have for centuries been angry towards other groups, and this was instrumentalized to maintain control. How do you suddenly say, okay, now we have to have these spheres of justice and veil of ignorance? It's a very different situation. Okay. So rights and universalism may work in a northern context, where the Enlightenment theory, or the Enlightenment theories of rights of man, by the way, is all very problematic. If you look at the Constitution of the United States, it says all men are created equal. Right? Certain people were excluded from that definition, such as slaves, such as women. So we can't say that even this universal view of rights in the United States or the global north, but they're even more far removed from the South, where you're kind of just projecting and using universalism as a way to attack the global South for being backwards, for being undemocratic, when we should be a little bit more careful about how we apply this game. We also, I bring up our previous criminal legalities in the global South, because in that context, if the law, which is supposed to be impartial and fair, is based on these ideas of equality, egalitarianism, which in the global south is a little bit more complicated, but it's not really about the law that we're talking about. Because the law, as many of you know, can sometimes be oppressive and scary. When you interact with a police officer, you're wondering, am I going to get bribed today? You try to avoid the law as opposed to seek rights from the law. So suddenly, we're not talking about rights in criminal law, we're talking about criminal legalities. And we talked a little bit about that in our previous episode. Now, in this book, when we engage the concept of minorities, the rights of criminal law, there are 4 themes that we go over. The 4 themes are, we look at, for instance, rebuilding after authoritarian. When we look at the different chapters, because we really did try. Initially, when I insisted we gotta keep the term minorities, when I insisted that we keep the term minorities, he said, we're gonna find all these amazing chapters on race, on gender, on sexuality, on class. But what we found was that nobody wrote on these chapters. And we specifically targeted people from the global south. We weren't going to Harvard or Berkeley or any of the American universities. We were going to universities outside of the US and the UK and Australia. We're trying to find people writing on race, gender, sexuality, and class. What we found was that people didn't do that type of work because that's the type of categories that existed perhaps in American universities, but in other universities outside of America, issues were a little bit more difficult. People were more concerned about rebuilding after violence. They were talking about there was a dictator, or there was a military government, and now we have to rebuild after that. And so many of the papers in our chapter, and I'll give you some examples, revolve around that topic. Another issue is, we were talking about Marxism and Gramsci. The idea of class emerges in terms of neoliberalism, in terms of the global South nations are more susceptible and vulnerable to pressures from outside to change the way in which you arrange your economy, and that affects minority race. So that's one thing that we talked about. Entrenched cultural values. Again, I'll give you some examples of this in the next slide. Entrenched cultural values argues that when we look at the way in which certain minorities are treated in the global South, these are historical, these are long-standing, and it's very difficult to change people's stereotypes, the perception of others, when these things are entrenched in the law. And finally, the criminalization of diversity. For the last decade, I've been working on anti-sodomy laws in Singapore. And what's interesting is anti-sodomy laws, which are sometimes seen as anti-gay, people will say, in Singapore, we're Asian. And therefore, we have these laws to protect our Asian values. And if you remove these laws, we're no longer Asian, we become Western. But they forget that the anti-sodomy law was actually a British penal code that had been in existence before, hundreds of years before Singapore became independent. So this process of foreign values, criminalizing certain communities, erasing that history, and then making it seem as if this is who we are today, that process is explored in the final section of the book. So let me show you some of the chapters of the book, and then I can open up for questions. I've spoken way too much. Rebuilding after violence, we have 3 great chapters. One on Brazil, about the kind of new prison massacre. There was this massacre in which prison guards just went, the military went to prison and just mowed down, just killed all the prisoners. And the issue here, the problem is that for decades, no one was held because who cares about these poor, black, dangerous individuals? And this was a product of an authoritarian, dictatorial government that used the law to kind of clean up the streets and trying to figure out how do we move on from that past, from those entrenched criminalization and entrenched cultural values, right? So you'll see that there's some overlap, but because this was distinctly in response to the moving on from the authoritarian government in Brazil. This one by Bashir and Nasiruddin, or Bashir and Nasir. Actually, this chapter is about Afghanistan. And when we were editing this chapter, the siege of Afghanistan by the Taliban. And so I was constantly writing to Nasir to see how he was doing. And in fact, the title itself is problematic. What I've learned is that when you work with minorities, the issues become very personal. Right? And they got very angry at this existing title. The new penal code and its limited protection for ethnic minorities post-conflict Afghanistan, because they said, I don't want to look like a Taliban sympathizer by saying that we are post-conflict. We are currently in the process of dealing with conflict. And so I have to fight with the publisher to remove the term post-conflict. The publisher rejected my request, but then I fought and finally they conceded. Then we have Colombia with the securitization narrative. So in Colombia, there is this really disgusting and terrible practice of we are going to give you a bonus from every rebel that you kill. And so what they did was they would create rebels out of non-rebels. Sometimes they would even go after disabled individuals and said, that guy was a rebel, so I killed him, so where's my bonus? And all of this was part of the authoritarian government trying to clean up the streets, the securitization. We need to secure our streets. In part two, we talked about the issue of capitalism, right? In India, there was the creation of different groups that were competing for economic power. And this was created by the British. Right? And if you know anything about this National Registry of Citizens, India is trying to create a more formal understanding of who is a citizen in the state by creating a registry. But in doing so, they're basically saying if you are a Muslim, you are not a citizen because you came across at this time. They get to create all of the different categories of who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. And of course, under the current administration that is pro-Hindu, if you're a Hindu, you are a citizen, you have all the rights. If you're a Muslim that came over at a different time, you have no rights. I talk about immigration in Singapore, and here I argue that, this is a little bit dated, but Donald Trump said that he wanted to copy Singapore. If you remember, he said, we don't want people from shithole countries coming into the US. We want to copy Singapore and Canada and the UK, which has this tier system where if you're educated, if you go to good schools, if you have a useful degree, we're going to give you points. The more points, the more attractive you are to come into the country. No more chain migration, no more because your family was in the States, you get to petition people, and if you probably have heard this situation, we erase this and we create, you can only come in if you have a high number of points. We in Singapore perfected the point system, but I argue that the point system is actually quite dehumanizing. And when you say that one's usefulness, utility, is based on their education or their background, it strips people of their humanity. And Singapore strips people of their humanity. And if you're going to copy Singapore, then the world is going to be miserable. Right? So that's kind of my argument. Hopefully we can erase that from the live stream. So we have a chapter on Pakistan and in order for development, and many of you probably are familiar with this, in order for development, you get rid of the slums. Right? In Pakistan, we call slums kacha abadi, and so she did this really rich ethnography of the removal of slums, or kacha abadi, in Pakistan. And then we have an interesting chapter on Puerto Rico, which, if you're familiar with Puerto Rico, it is actually U.S. territory. And as U.S. territory, it's under a lot of pressure from the U.S. to reform its laws. And certain catastrophes, such as hurricanes or COVID, are used by the state to rapidly change the laws to suit the needs of the larger, powerful nation. In terms of cultural values, in Singapore, we look at sexual violence and how in Singapore, to this day, it is not possible for a woman to rape a man because men are virile and have penises, and women are victims, right? And this is entrenched in the law. And the laws still protect women in terms of, there's a law called outrage of modesty, which is used a lot, especially at the National University of Singapore, where we've had a lot of sexual scandals recently. But the law is meant to protect women who are vulnerable, weak, docile, from men who are strong, aggressive. Right? And this comes from old Victorian values that are very British, that we have to this day, that we haven't really moved on from. We see a similar situation, but slightly inverted, in Brazil, where they also believe that women play this important role in our society as mothers. And therefore, we should allow mothers who commit crimes to leave so that they can take care of their kids. Because who can take care of their kids? Just women, right? So we see this entrenchment of gendered values of who should be taking care of kids, but then we also see how in many global south countries, you have these laws, but they never work. Right? And so that's a really interesting chapter. Could you click on the so there are two chapters on the Philippines that you might be interested in. The first is by Pablo Chiopini, my co-author or co-editor. He talks about the war on drugs. And we did a lot of interviews with criminal court legal professionals. So we just interviewed like 60 different prosecutors and asked them what they thought about their job, what they thought about their role. And it's really interesting how many of them believed that they were serving society by putting criminals in jail. Because these people are stupid, these people are broken, these people are, and then you can start to see all of these stereotypes, all of these biases that have been entrenched, that if you are educated of a certain class and a certain standing, you are a good citizen. And if you look a certain way, perhaps your forehead is a certain size, or your eyes are too close together, you should be put in jail. And we're doing society a favor by putting you in jail. Also, side story, because I know Jason Lamchek, and I go way back as well. I don't know if you've heard of attorney Romeo Capullo. He was one of the attorneys who sued Marcos for reparations on a number of the victims under the Marcos regime. And I volunteered with his office, and Jason was my supervisor. And then it turns out that he moved to Singapore. So we worked together. Oh, he worked with Pablo on this chapter. 3 more chapters and I'll be done. Circuits of law. This was an interesting chapter on transgender. In Turkey, Turkey is trying to become part of the European Union. So they are implementing European Union laws, such as, let's get rid of all of those criminalization of transgender sex workers, and instead just fine them. That's a kinder, gentler way of punishing people who commit crimes. We shouldn't criminalize these people, we should just fine them. But in interviews, this is actually a lot more painful, where every single day you're losing money because they get to decide, oh, just, can you imagine police officers, all they did was just constantly extract money from you because of a minor infraction. And as a trans sex worker, you're constantly being chased after for those fines. So, Veronica Gregorio was a PhD student in our department, and she recently finished PhD. She's 59, and she was doing research on sociology of family in Mindanao. And as she was doing her research, she started to encounter a lot of trans women who did sex work. And she asked, well, why do you do sex work? And then we talked about how there aren't, it's not like you're readily accepted by society, and by going online and by doing sex work, you can actually make friends, maybe even find love, and also financially support yourself. So this is a really interesting chapter. And then finally, this chapter, another problematic situation for me was it's about the same law that we have in Singapore, the anti-sodomy law, which in Africa, in the country of Malawi, we have this anti-sodomy law where we basically said sodomy is a Western phenomenon, and we have to eradicate this from our society. Whereas Nigel argues that these queer practices have been in existence throughout African history, but the laws are suddenly making it seem as if queer identities don't exist. And actually, just briefly, the problem here was that Nigel identifies as gay men, and when we submitted the book to Calgary, they erased Nigel's pronouns and turned Nigel into a he, him. And so I had to ask them to reinstate pronouns, and they said no. And so we had to fight again. We work with minorities, there are these really important issues that we have to fight for. Even a publisher that's supposed to provide us with the space to talk about these issues and stuff. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I know I talked way too long. There's a, you can find the book online there. And please follow me on Twitter. I need to increase my Twitter followers. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radics. So we would like at this point to extend the conversation to our audience, particularly the students and colleagues who might have questions regarding Dr. Radics' work, particularly the edited volume that he and his colleagues recently. First of all, thank you. Thank you, George, for being here with us and for gracing us with your presence. It's good to see you again.
Good to see
Anyone might have questions or points of clarification at this point, more than welcome.
George, thank you so much. I mean, I really admire your commitment to the global South, with scholarship in, by, among global South scholars. I hope this is an inspiration to our students, some of whom here have been listening intently to your discussion. Maybe one or two questions for us to reflect on as global South citizens here. Number one, what constitutes the global South? I know it has been a long-standing debate in the literature, but how do you approach it? Is China global South? Is Singapore global South?
And I'll explain, and that's a fantastic question.
So I want you to share with us your thoughts about this thing. Does it have to do with social reality? And then number two, how different is minoritization in the global South from minoritization in the global North? We began with that wonderful literature review of the formation of minorities. But does it make a difference for the global South to constructing for minorities? I suspect we may have to do a similar practice apart from colonization. Yeah, those are the two questions maybe we can do.
Yeah. Those are excellent questions. And you hit some controversial points there, because Pablo and I always argue.
Yeah.
Like, we have this very contentious relationship where I kind of hate him, but we work together and we make great work. Right? And if you're watching Pablo, I respect you a lot, but we fight a lot because he's always saying Singapore is not part of the global South, it's wealthy. But it's not just about wealth, right? I mean, we just saw 2 chapters about entrenched values that women cannot rape men. I mean, okay, not that women are going around raping men, but the possibility is there, and we erase that because we don't think that women are capable of committing such crimes. And where does that come from? It comes from these kind of colonial values that have been entrenched in our society that we are trying to untangle. Even the categories of how our nations are defined were given to us externally, right? The name of the Philippines is named after the King of Spain. So how do you organically create an identity when some of this identity was given to you? And that process, regardless of if you're rich or if you're poor, that's still there. And so that's why I argue it's influenced by the global South. Now, there was a big controversy over China, because in our previous book, someone said, where's China? Why is China not there? And then, let's face it, China bullies the global South. China is land grabbing our islands in the South. And I'm sorry, since I have the stage, I can state my opinion. And I don't think that China belongs in the global South, at least not right now. Because China is setting the boundaries. We talk about the economic pressures of the powerful nations onto the weaker nations. China is not one of those powerful nations that is placing economic pressure, that is taking the lands of other nations, that is forcing other nations to reapply themselves in their shadow. So that's why. And of course, it's open for debate. Your second question on the categories, or at least minoritization. I think the fact that you use the term processes is a good thing. I basically have been challenging the categories of minorities. The processes and the experience. We're all human beings, and we're all going to feel the same pain, the same dehumanization, regardless if you're in the north or the south. But those categories that are inflicted upon us, so that I don't really look at the experience of minorities as much as I do about the process of creating categories. So that's how I look at that.
Thank you, Dr. Cornelio, for setting the stage. Anyone else from the audience who would like to ask questions or probably share their additional insights? More than welcome to do so, of course.
Crime students? Do you want to ask? Just have one question. I'm wondering about, well, first and foremost, thank you very much for outlining the evolution of the sociology of crime. That was, I think, very helpful, not only probably for the students and also for us, to thinking through about this. And also, for giving us a front seat ride on the struggles that you have with the publisher, the sausage making of publishing, the fights that you've been waging. That was really enjoyable. Gives us a good view on how this supposed debate is being seen from that angle, from that view, which leads me into one other area of probably concern and question that is very much consuming the global South and global North relations, and that is the question of human rights. So I'm wondering about how you would view and categorize the application of human rights on the conditions of criminal legalities in its diversified context, such as the different historical and social conditions and trajectory on the decolonized and post-colonial regions of the world. So to what extent would human rights view perspective be, shall we say, helpful in truly understanding the dynamics that goes on in the post-colonial areas that is trying to decolonize and moving away from global North expectations of what is the moral compass
That's another difficult question.
Sorry, that's also the question I've been wrapping up.
Because I mentioned that I went to school in the US, and I'm used to these ideas about universalism, and I don't project. I do believe that there should be a universal standard, right? But the question is, how do they apply, and how are they being used as a tool to kind of criticize or attack global South nations? That's one issue. So we're trying to shed light on how human rights can be seen from a different perspective. But whether or not we as individuals are all equal, perhaps I've been brainwashed. I believe that is human rights, that there should be a universal standard and a cultural relativist stance. I'm personally not a huge fan of saying that each country should have different standard rights. But there are different arguments that we should explore. For instance, right now, I'm doing research. I have to rush off at the end of this to do an interview because LGBT rights in Southeast Asia, we like to say that LGBT identities is like a Western foreign phenomenon. Now, we as Asians have Asian values, and Asian values was a pushback against the universal idea of human rights. During the 1980s and 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and the West started to force other countries to open up and to adopt the values of the West. And Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir, Malaysia, and Singapore pushed back and said, we are Asian, we do not need to adopt human rights in the same way. And I argue that we are Asian and we do not need to have rights in the same way. I think is highly problematic because often that is used to attack Asian people as well as attack them. And so that's why I'm doing two projects in the Philippines right now. One is talking to activists who work on access to abortions in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, and I'm looking at LGBT rights activists in Southeast Asia to see how the rights discourse can sometimes be problematic. Even though they're using the human rights discourse, the human rights discourse is also something that is used against them by the state or by critiques that are saying that, like, oh, you want gay rights because you've been westernized, or abortion access is going to destroy the family. Women should be back in the home taking care of kids. They shouldn't be having abortions and sleeping around. Right? So that's I don't know if that answers your question. It's a complicated situation where I believe that human rights should be universal, but I also believe that the way in which human rights have been deployed sometimes is problematic, and one those who are trying to push. It's a little complicated to say.
Can do harm more than good.
Sometimes,
The way it's called.
Thank you, Dr. Decolonial. We probably have room for one more question or comment before we again thank Dr. Radics for taking his time to visit us, share with us his reason.
Very nice. Everyone, sir, thank you so much for your stuff. I just have one question. So, in our class, we learned that criminality is connected to social values, and deviance. Criminality and deviance. So, once society has social values, and when people go against those social values, they are deviants, they're criminals. What is, obviously there are discrepancies that involve our president who is, an active leader, but people hate, people are supposed to be that, people who don't obey the law. But there's a term pasaway, and people, but people say na, mga Pinoy pasaway talaga. People are supposed to hate pasaway, but they adore our president, who is a pasaway, but at the same time, oh, he's so well mannered. So parang may parang values na that are held in higher regard than the others. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, with everything that's going on, like the inflation and parang life is getting harder every day, and people who support him not seemingly still accepting the reality that it's not getting any better because of him and he's not doing anything about it. How exactly are we going to like, I mean, I'm not asking for like a one size fits all solution. What's something, what can we do to like help people see the reality or how can we like, um, yeah, how can we make other people see the reality that, hey, he's not what we think he is. So maybe, like, let's organize. Let's organize and protest.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. It's a very difficult question. I mean, when Duterte was elected to presidency, that was one big mess that many of us were trying to make sense of. And then Marcos got elected to presidency, another, I think the issue here is not to, for me personally, I don't agree with Duterte's policies. I certainly don't like the idea of another Marcos as president. But it's not really about my own feeling. It's more about trying to understand why is it that people are so frustrated, and also why is it that people that history can be manipulated so easily, so that we forget that these injustices happened in the past. What is going on from a sociology of deviance perspective, or even just a sociological perspective? What is going on that is making it so that these types of politicians can be elected? And it's not just the Philippines. We know Donald Trump was in office. We know Brexit took place in the UK. There's something going on globally. Now, I don't want to say that the global phenomenon is the same all over. In fact, that's part of the reason why these projects that I'm working on right now with abortion and LGBT, trying to investigate what exactly is going on here in Southeast Asia, here in the Philippines, that makes it so that conservative values, anti-human values are suddenly okay. Right? Because there was a time in the Philippines where the Philippines was like the poster child for democracy because of people power revolution. But then that was reframed as it didn't work, and so now we have to go back to, so there's something going on. Whether or not I know what is going on, I don't. I'm still investigating. But I think, at least, I believe my job is to try to understand the context. Because if you understand why people are so resentful, then you can also understand why people are willing to accept these views that may be unjust, unfair, and inhumane. But people are willing to rewrite their history to support whatever is going forward. Is there just like gross inequality that is making that people are thinking we need something drastic to change the current circumstance? Because as you said, inflation, life is just getting harder, traffic never lets up, something is going on. Maybe if we get a dictator, we can just break this chain. And so if that's the case, if life is getting harder and harder and harder, perhaps that's one of the reasons that we have such drastic politicians being elected into such bombastic politicians.
So life is getting harder, so let's just make it even harder.
Or life is getting harder, and maybe we can find ways to make life less hard, so that people will become less prone to voting in such bombastic, crazy Donald Trump secretaries of revenue. Because, sorry, that was a great question, in my own work, I also look at, in the United States, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. In the UK, I was in London at the time of Brexit, and I remember I was at this wonderful workshop at King's College around people from all over the world, and we're talking about those crazy people who believed that Brexit was going to happen. But we were, you know, I guess I'm talking too much, but I'll just wrap up on this point. But we were blindsided. And many of you in this room have privilege. Many of you are at the best university, or one of the best universities in the Philippines. We've worked hard, we got here, and you can't forget that there are other people who worked hard and didn't get here and who are resentful. And how do we address that resentment? How do we make sure that people don't feel left behind and feel like they're willing to make a change, like Brexit, or Donald Trump, or Duterte, or Marcos? I think that's, at the personal level, I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you, Eric. All right, so on that note, we would like to thank Dr. Radics again for visiting us and for sharing his thoughts about time, media, and for giving us access to this most recent work. We also want to thank colleagues, Dr. Lizalin, Dr. Ateneo, of course, Dr. Nanugay, and of course our students who are part of the Sociology and Anthropology, just particularly those who are taking the today's class. We enjoyed your company, we enjoyed the insights that you shared with us today. So thanks again, and we look forward to more engagement.
Just finished. Bye. 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 Bye.